I am Jesse Kohler from the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, or CTIPP, with the sincere pleasure of being with Peter Buckley from Southern Oregon Success, Jennifer Brinkmann from Alive and Well Communities in Missouri, and Father Paul Abernathy from the Neighborhood Resilience Project in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, all leaders doing incredible community-oriented work, promoting trauma-informed, prevention-oriented, resilience-focused, and healing-centered approaches in their communities, here to talk about the ways in which we are really integrating the principles and values of community-led, trauma-informed, prevention-oriented, resilience-focused, and healing-centered approaches at the local level. And so we will start from going from west to east. And so, Peter, starting with you, what barriers have you faced in your work so far, and how have you overcome them?
Well, the biggest barrier that we ran into was to work differently in this idea of what's the governance structure of the work. You know, we work with folks in education at all levels, healthcare, mental health care, human services, public safety, workforce development. All of them have their own boards, et cetera, et cetera. So when we first started, there was a real tendency to wanted to develop a structure that was similar to what people were working in, and that we'd have a board, we have an executive committee, that kind of structure. And it really kind of held us back. We had a lot of good fortune raising awareness with our ACEs training team, a great group of volunteers with support from their employers to take time to go out in the community and raise awareness with the near curriculum from ACE Interface. So we raised a lot of awareness, but we got stuck on this governance issue. You know, how are we going to govern ourselves? And it wasn't until we started working with a group called Co-Creative, which is studied collaboration. And they really studied what we were doing, what we were trying to do. And they convinced us basically to throw out the charter we had developed. We spent a year developing a charter about how we work with each other. And they really came down to us and said, look, the most important thing is you're developing a common language and a common understanding through the near curriculum. Focus on the work. Don't focus on the governance. Focus on the work. And they really led us into this process of saying what exactly you're trying to accomplish. And for our region, like many regions, is how do we go upstream as much as possible? Okay, focus on that. Focus on how you're going to frame your work. We chose the Strengthening Families framework that our early learning hub, early learning educators in our region were working to look at how we intentionally strengthen families. And we took those principles of the Strengthening Families framework, combined it with Co-Creative's process to put the work at the center, and that really accelerated the work for us.
Two quick things. One, you mentioned neuroscience, and just for those who may not know, just want to spell out that that's neuroscience, epigenetics, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and resilience sciences, developed by Laura Porter and her team. But it sounds like that reflection orientation and the ongoing process of learning and growth must have been so hard to have developed this structure for a year and then have someone tell you, just get rid of that for you. But that process of learning and growth is a necessary part of the process, it sounds like, that's been so helpful for you.
Absolutely. And it was quite remarkable. We had a 22-member steering committee. And after working with Co-Creative for a pretty short period of time, we did a strategic planning session. And by lunch of that day, the 22-member steering committee had voted themselves out of existence, because they simply said, you can't function with a 22-member steering committee. We have to be more nimble, and we have to get the focus on the work.
That's incredible. Thank you. And Jennifer, in Missouri and your work with Alive and Well, what are the barriers that you've faced so far, and how do you work to overcome them?
Well, first of all, I'm really reflecting on what Peter said, thinking about how what we're calling barriers really are opportunities to grow into the work and do it even better. And for us, I think our journey, where we had folks who'd been leading the trauma-informed movement from the mental health perspective, but when we started this work, we said we wanted to center the community experience. And we said, if we're going to do that, we have to hear from those who are most impacted. In Missouri, that's people who are Black and Brown in most communities, not all. We really started to sit down and realize we couldn't do this work without an anti-racist lens. And that took a while for us to get our heads around, because these had been two things happening in parallel paths, but not in a braided way. And so I think we're still working on that today, of uncovering the synergies in those two lines of work and how, if we do that together, we can get to true healing and ultimately equity. So I'd say that's been our biggest growth journey. And then also having systems that are willing to come along in that journey with us and not be scared of it. And willing to lean into the difficult, hard work that is, and also really rewarding.
There's an element that becomes very confusing for some when we have these conversations, because trauma-informed work, and like you said, the integration of, we call it accessibility, belonging, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, ABDEIJ, or anti-racist lenses in the work. It works across systems. And so you brought up the need to sort of gain partnership across all of these systems and the complexities there. And I know that you've had some success in doing that. And obviously that's an ongoing part of your journey and process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've integrated the education system, and the healthcare systems have been where our two biggest intentional focuses have been, of giving them frameworks and ways to look at organizational culture change, so that they can come to the table and be part of cross-sector conversations of understanding, for example, how health depends on the education system, and the education system depends on the health system, and how do we come together to create different outcomes in our community.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And then Father Paul, I'll also take a step out of, like Peter said, sort of decentralizing leadership here. After we hear from Father Paul, like get into more of a free-flowing conversation where I'll interject with some questions, but this is a really wonderful ongoing conversation. So Father Paul, the way that you at the Neighborhood Resilience Project and are doing this in Pittsburgh in the communities that you serve, and I know that it's on a block level, you do it at a hyper micro level, this work.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's so good to be with you, Jesse, and Peter, Jennifer. Of course, good to be with the both of you. There are extraordinary challenges in doing community-based trauma-informed work in communities that are really inundated with trauma on a continual basis. I mean, there was a young woman who said to me years ago, I was on a panel after there had been a string of homicides among youth in one particular neighborhood. And there was a young girl who was there, 14 years old. She was the twin of a 14-year-old brother who was murdered actually earlier that year. And what she had said to me was, well, not just to me, to the entire panel, the problem with you people is you keep talking about post. People were saying post-traumatic stress. And for us, she said, it's not post, it's current. What does it look like to really build a trauma-informed movement in the heart of what we call in our work a trauma-affected community? There's a lot of conversation around ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and the prevalence of ACEs. And although there's trauma in every community, there is not the same levels of trauma in every community. I mean, Jennifer had mentioned these communities that are most impacted. She said Black and brown communities. We, of course, when the ACE test, of course, the researchers are saying a score 4 or higher puts you at an elevated risk for negative impact on adult health and behavior. And 14% of Americans have a score of 4 or higher. But when we did a pilot study in our community, we found that 61% of respondents had a score of 4 or higher. And by the way, we have to also acknowledge that there's racial bias in the ACE test itself, because the ACE test never asked, have you ever experienced violence? Have you ever witnessed gun violence? Have you ever experienced racism? Have you ever experienced poverty for an extended period of time? But we all are aware of well, or some of us may not be aware of the sort of expanded ACEs that were added on a pilot in Philadelphia, 6 questions in which there were 13.9% of respondents who only had one of these 6 expanded ACEs. That is to say, if we were to take the regular ACE test, their score would have been 0, but they were exposed to significant levels of trauma other than that. That has been a significant challenge, in doing the trauma-informed work where there is disproportionate and daily experiences of trauma. We had a double homicide just last night, continuing to do that, to come in and do that work again this morning. It is a very real struggle. The second thing I would simply say is that the other struggle really is engaging systems and broader engagement with stakeholders that need really need to be leveraged in order to make real movement, from my perspective, to implement trauma-informed strategies on a community level. Some of our systems are not truly trauma-informed. There are some partners who not only are they not truly trauma-informed, they resist, I would say, a trauma-informed perspective. And that becomes a real great challenge. And part of that becomes really the impetus for making sure that we engage in education really with these groups too. People sometimes look and they say, okay, well, I'm a priest, obviously, Orthodox priest. They say, Father, you got a ministry to the poor. And I often remind people, oh, indeed, there is a ministry to the rich as well. And that's where we have to get in there and engage and do this work and help really educate, help really leverage these good-hearted people in systems, in organizations to hopefully build the movement at, where there is concentrated power as well.
Appreciate that, Father Paul. And sort of feeding off of that, I'm curious the ways in which policy and legislation that are getting passed, how do we ensure that it reaches people and communities who need support and resources? Because a lot of policies use the word trauma. They may even say trauma-informed, but they just sort of use that language. And, that doesn't mean that it's actually trauma-informed, which is a current struggle of the movement at large, I would say, is where language and action sort of meet up with each other. So how do we ensure that we are creating trauma-informed systems? Because we've started to talk about that a bit. But Peter, I'm curious from your perspective as a former Ways and Means chair, as well as working at a community coalition level, like sort of what you think, and then Jennifer and Father Paul, obviously your thoughts as well.
Sure. Yeah, it really is a challenge to get from the policy level to actually the practical level. We have just released for the state of Oregon our next 5-year strategic plan for early childhood. It's called Raise Up Oregon 2.0. And it's like 51 pages. And it's like all the state agencies. And every state agency is saying, this is what we are going to do to implement trauma-informed practices across our work. And they all want to get down to, they sincerely want to get down to the community level. But it goes back to something I just said just about our own collaboration. It's hard to let go of that governance, that the traditional governance. We've governed in this way. And so I think it's the idea has gotten through to people enough so that all these large agencies in our state are saying, okay, can you organize a focus group for us? Can you organize an advisory committee for us? So we go through that cycle a lot. Them saying they want to hear from people. But the biggest challenge, at least from the state side, is to have state support with local control, to actually empower the people on the local level to have the resources from the state, but be able to make the decisions on a local basis. That's a huge challenge for them to let go of. And I understand it because when I was in the legislature, there was always that kind of thing of like, well, you're funding that. How do you know that is going to get a good return on investment? How do you know that's because you have to choose between priorities, right? So how do you know you're choosing the right priority? So I do understand that. But we've developed a couple things in Oregon, the coordinated care organization model of healthcare delivery, the CCO model, as we call it, has helped us move in that direction of getting decisions made on the local level around the social determinants of health. And that's given us a chance to accelerate trauma-informed work through the Medicaid system here. So that's been very helpful. So again, I can just point it out as a challenge. You can never stop working on it. And the ability, the more the ability is to give the state support, but local decision-making, the more progress you're going to make.
I'd say from our perspective, we're really focusing on co-creating policy from the ground up. And just an example is we worked with some youth from across the state over 2 years to really identify what do they need in order, from a policy perspective, in order to be well. And they came up with a set of policy recommendations that we're helping to advance and advocate for them. But I think to Father Paul's point too, if we're doing the work right, we're working with folks who are impacted by trauma. And even in going to them and saying, oh, can you do a focus group, isn't sufficient. So how is our engagement with them part of the healing process? That we're inviting them into community with us in a way that supports their well-being and healing, isn't just taking their intellectual capital from them, but also giving them something in return for being part of that with us, and then really honoring what they say and lifting that up and bringing that forward. I'd say we're still in the middle of that and building that out, but I think for us, it's the only way forward is to walk in and with community and hopefully help connect access into systems partners that care and can, create the outcome that we're all hoping for.
Yeah, I really appreciate that point, and I would say even to just further expand on that I think it becomes very important. Yes, we've got to co-create policy together. I think thinking about how the policy process itself is trauma informed is absolutely key and significant. How also maybe community development processes themselves are also trauma informed. And the reason why I think there's a true connection between the two is because often people who have this, I want to say not only on a personal level have severe traumatic exposure, but when their social networks also have severe traumatic exposure. I mean, what happens is we have whole communities that are essentially marginalized. They're left out of the policy planning process. They maybe have lower rates of voter participation, or whatever the high rates of incarceration, which knocks them completely out of the political system. And all of these barriers prevent people from really engaging, and not let alone the policy process itself not being trauma informed. There's too many policies, I think to Jennifer's point, that are really being developed behind closed doors by people who are, let's say, professional think tank members of one degree or another. And I think what we have to do is we have to design, yes, co-create. We have to design these policies with the people they are going to affect most profoundly. Now, what I'll say is sometimes what we really have a tendency to do is to invite people into a particular process. There's still a balance of power that I think can be a tremendous challenge in developing an authentic policy to really affect change in certain parts of our community. I think it's just as important to spend real time developing people in the community who are better positioned and better able to participate in policy creation, and also to help them establish their own policy tables. I think it's so often we got to invite these people to this table, but what about helping them create a table of their own? We might get an invitation one day, and we'll see what comes out of that. I think this is where we have to say trauma-informed empowerment, voice, and choice. How seriously do we take this trauma-informed principle? And what is the role of policy in this? And also developing the leadership among these communities to lead us collectively forward, certainly in partnership with people from different communities. I think we've got to do that intentionally.
I think also there's this huge opportunity. I've always said for the trauma-informed lens to be the shared lens that we can use to have a conversation about policy and whether or not it is moving us forward. So my dream would be that we could get to a point where community can inform our policymakers, those who are paid to be in those seats, for them to understand if what they're proposing is trauma-informed or not. And you talked, Jesse, about lack of definition around what really is trauma-informed. Community knows. Community knows. And so if we can have tables that are accessed and valued of telling us of, we think we're doing something that's helpful, but is it truly trauma-informed?
And one of the best pieces of advice that Laura Porter from ACE Interface gave to us when we were first starting off was, she said, get this information out to the community and your community will tell you what needs to happen. And that is what's happening in our case. We've been doing this for 7 years now. And as we've gotten this information out to people, people have come forward and said, well, wait a second, given this information, this is impossible, that we're basically abandoning people who are pregnant and not giving them the support they need. It's insane for us to not give the support that someone who's pregnant needs in order to have a safe pregnancy and to have their child have a good start in life. It's insane for us not to do that. So our community told us that very, very loudly and directed where the effort had to go.
And Peter, you bring up Laura, and I just want to emphasize that what we're talking about here is not theoretical, right? When Laura was the director of the Family Policy Council in Washington State from 1994 to 2011, which is not the only trauma-informed effort from a state level, but certainly has the best data that was collected over longitudinal time, but creating community capacity from a state level, but sort of decentralizing that leadership and just sustaining a learning process that layered over time. There was a 35x return on investment. They in that one county, Cowlitz County, reduced youth suicide and suicide attempts by 98%, reduced teen pregnancy by 50%, reduced, graduation or high school dropout rates as well, and so many other outcomes by addressing the root cause. So what we're talking about has been proven and is effective. And so how do we scale? I think that one of the things that drives me crazy in the policy space is oftentimes how siloed the work gets, and that is in and of itself a symptom of institutional and systemic trauma, and that truly coordinating and aligning, like has come up, the coordination and alignment across different service sectors and different aspects of the government, instead of working in tight little silos, is part of what trauma-informed governance looks like, and then really creating conditions and capacities so that way, like we're saying, the community can do their own work and help us understand through biocratic systems and organizations, living systems that continue to grow over time, inform the ways that we continue to move forward in our efforts to better meet the needs of the public at large. I'm curious, we've brought up the need to engage diverse lived experience at multiple times. And, I think that sometimes governments and systems at large will engage lived experience, but in tokenized ways. We engaged young people, but we brought in one 17-year-old, right? Like, how do we authentically and genuinely engage lived experience and create conditions of empowerment and safety that allow for people to show up as their authentic and genuine selves, to be part of this co-creative process?
I'm sure Father Paul has got a lot more info than this, because he's engaged with people who've been marginalized on an everyday basis. So I'd love to hear his response.
I think that it becomes really important to consider what really is the mechanism of engagement, because I think until we really take a hard look at that, we're going to have a hard time getting the kind of authentic and equitable engagement with people from people with lived experience that is very important. I mean, so often engagement is so predicated on the ability of these particular people to make it to wherever it is they have to make it to. And whatever that looks like. And I think when you consider the hard work that has to go into engagement, it is very time intensive. It is very relational. It requires a lot of failures. It requires getting a lot of doors slammed in your face. And I mean, I think that the real challenge with this is that we Americans in particular are an extraordinarily impatient people. What we really want is we want a quick policy fix to problems that have been going on for generations. To consider what that sustained effort looks like and what the mechanism looks like is where I think this is where government has to really partner with organizations, institutions that actually are quite proficient in this. I've often said, the truth of it is we know really how to do this very well. We know really how to do this very well. I was in a conversation with a healthcare system, I want to say last year, and there was a question on the table of how do we really engage people, and we don't understand this. We have there's an extraordinary concentration of trauma in this area. We can't build awareness and all this and that. And what, it occurred to me that if we actually approached that the way that we approach elections, boy, we would make a huge impact. Think about the voting campaign and voter turnout and how we concentrate and all of the science that goes into that. I mean, we as a society actually know exactly what community engagement looks like and how to really do it in a very effective way. If the trauma-informed movement could approach this the way we approach voting campaigns, boy, we would make some tremendous effort in positive movement with trauma-informed policy?
Yes, yes. I come to this work as my background before all this was marketing. And when I first heard the trauma science, I said, how doesn't the whole world not know this? So how do we get this out there in a way and put to work the things that we, as you say, already know how to do? And I think in terms of engagement of communities who are most impacted, it has to come down to relationship. And that is part of marketing, but also spending true time with folks, and folks who know, giving them the leadership to lead it, and the resources, and trusting them. And so often we don't do that. We don't compensate that the way it should be compensated, and we don't invest that way. And I'd say for us, it's elevating the leadership of those who are most impacted, and investing in them to lead the work where they are. And so how do we replicate that and do that over and over again?
A factor that's really come up here strongly is the idea of trusted community partners. We have our Family Advisory Council that meets once a month to kind of guide the work that's happening. And as we brought forth different proposals, they would consistently point to say, well, La Clinica, if La Clinica does this, we'll go along with it. Yep. If Rogue Community Health or Southern University is willing to go there, if there's a trusted community partner, that can be a way to actually move work forward in a way that people will have confidence in, because they already have trust for that established relationship.
Just want to highlight as well that sometimes when I use the word diversity or equity and inclusion, certain in our overly politicized world, and I just don't want to skirt over the reality of what we engage with, that puts some people into a defensive perspective. And we will unabashedly discuss, again, one of the principles of trauma-informed care is a recognition of cultural, gender, and historical issues. And so we cannot skirt over structural and institutional racism, but true diversity, true equity, and true inclusion also includes the realities and paradigms of people who live in very conservative areas and communities that are all white, and there are deep traumas that exist in multiple communities. And so continuing to build out accessibility, belonging, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice that incorporates everyone, and creating conditions and conversations that allow for all of those people to show up authentically and genuinely while honoring their own lived experiences, which we live in a very big country. And if we start talking about doing this work around the world, it gets even bigger. And so there are different paradigms and perspectives that we come to this work through. And it is just important that we honor and value those various perspectives and paradigms as we come together through this work, Jennifer, like you said, where this trauma-informed care is an opportunity for us all to come together and engage in the co-creative process of creating better systems and structures that allow for our world to truly move forward toward a sustainable planet and a better place for all.
And Jesse, you bring a great point in, and just understand how our brain works. I mean, that to me is transformational. I didn't learn this information until I was in my late 50s. And all of a sudden I'm being told, well, this is actually how your brain works. And everybody's brain works the same way. And if there's overwhelming stress in your life, your brain's going to react, etc. So just even getting the science of how the brain works is just an important factor. It tends to break down barriers between people. At least that's been my experience. Is if you mentioned the rural, I have former colleagues from the legislature, Republicans who represent very rural districts. But when I talk to them about the work that we're doing, and I'm a former Democratic legislator, they're 100% supportive of it, because it does, they are working with families who are in pain, in crisis. I'm working with families who are in pain and crisis. So that understanding, here's some information that can help. That's a universal link.
And I'll just add, we just had a conversation. We hosted an event last week here in Missouri, and we centered the conversation in Sikeston, Missouri, which is in rural southeast Missouri, to make the point that so often when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, that can be shorthand for some of urban. And to say that this involves all of us. And then in fact, when we look at health outcomes, poor folks in rural Missouri are just as bad off as those who are worse off in our urban communities. And I love the quote, I think it's People's Institute, that says, and I know it takes a while to unpack, and I'm always happy to help people unpack it, but white people aren't poor because of their race, but they are poor because of racism. And I think understanding how racism at the core is creating poor health outcomes for all of us.
Well, yeah, I agree, and I think that what the trauma-informed movement really presents is it almost has the potential to be, in the most profound sense, a reconciliation movement all at the same time. Because I think so often in our society is that there is this propensity to demonize the other. I think that's what's happening this day today, and I mean. For me, I believe it is extremely important to raise up the trauma and the plight of rural, poor white America. I mean, this is a human concern, and I think it should be at the forefront of our concern, even and especially as people of color, to really consider this and to understand that when someone else suffers trauma, we are suffering trauma too. We have to, one of the things I think becomes very, very important in the trauma-informed movement is that I think we have to be very, very sensitive too, because in the whole conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, not all perspectives can be lended most easily towards reconciliation. That is to say that language does matter. And sometimes what we say, and even if we're working towards a positive end, we use a particular language that can come off the wrong way towards the other side, or it can seemingly demonize, even if it's not overt. Maybe it seemingly demonizes the other. I think that when it comes to any conversation around, like racial diversity, and there has to be even a particular standard. Yes, we have to acknowledge the role of racism in propagating trauma among certain people groups in our country. And at the same time, we have to be very, very wary of any kind of language or perspective or ideology that would have us simply if I could quote W.E.B. Du Bois, he has this great perspective on the Reconstruction that he offers in Souls of Black Folk, in which he said the real trouble with the Freedmen's Bureau that was initiated in the aftermath of the Civil War to help integrate freed slaves into society. The real problem with the Freedmen's Bureau, he said, is that it spent too much time trying to put the bottom rail on top instead of working to foster goodwill between the Negro and the white man. And I think that too often we have ideologies that are trying to put the bottom rail on top, at least in language. We have to really work to foster goodwill, seeking healing and restoration for all human beings.
Father Paul, that reminds me of conversations we've had where you've talked about, and we've sort of alluded to this in conversation, all of us, but the trauma-informed movement has an opportunity to learn from the successes of the civil rights movement, but the ways in which we equipped community members and really trained across language and how we were going to go about the process that led to such transformative changes and where that can go.
This is such an important point, Jesse, because part of the challenge, I think, now is that we have what I might describe as a lot of social media movements. I remember in the summer of 2020, where were the protests? Here's how there was one protest we had in town, that happened in town. It was a young girl, she was in high school. She said, I'm going down to protest the corner of, she put the corner on social media, and she was honestly thought it was gonna be her and 13 of her friends. It ended up, there was 1,500 people that showed up. And everybody had their signs, and nobody knew where they were going, what to do, and or what was the objective. And I think about that scenario and how completely opposite it was from the civil rights movement. I mean, we leverage in the trauma-informed world, we leverage social media, but sometimes we do so without the benefit of true organization, true discipline, true objectives. The civil rights movement, there was this vast infrastructure that was developed. We had the nonviolent training centers in Nashville, Tennessee. How in the world do people know how to do these sit-ins and have cigarettes put out on them and coffee poured on them and cereal put on their head? And how in the world did they do that? We had the nonviolent training centers. We had the freedom schools, citizenship schools. We had the Highlander Institute. Martin Luther King was trained. Rosa Parks was trained. And sometimes we might say, well, where is the Martin Luther King of the trauma-informed movement? But then we have to also say, there is no training to develop the Martin Luther King of the trauma-informed movement. So I think we have to think, for me, if we look at trauma with the same kind of urgency that our elders looked at civil rights, and I actually believe that civil rights is a component of trauma-informed interest, to be honest with you. But I believe that we had the same kind of intentionality. If we develop the same kind of infrastructure to develop the kind of leadership that we need to move trauma-informed policy forward, I think we would make more success in a much, I would say, in a much faster pace, at least.
I think that that's a perfect transition, and it's hard to believe that our time is starting to come up. This conversation has flown by, and I will just say now that I hope that we have many more conversations amongst this group, and like we've talked about with so many others, and see this permeate through. But I think that this is a beautiful transition to the last question that we had discussed of what makes us hopeful for the future, and what is it that we're most excited about for the trauma-informed movement.
There's so much. There's so much that makes me hopeful. I've seen people just come up with incredible ideas, being willing to bring them forward. I mentioned earlier how the community talked about we really have to focus on folks who are pregnant and really support this group of healthcare providers and early childhood providers got together to form something called the Oasis Center in Medford, and they have wraparound services for pregnant women who are struggling with substance abuse. It's a remarkable program that grew, and now they're moving into housing with that work as well. So, I mean, I have hope every single day, because every single day I see something just amazing to happen. The Phoenix Town School District, it's a low-income school district in our region. Their graduation rate in 2017 was 67%. They implemented trauma-informed practices in a really intentional, smart way. Their graduation rate in 2021 was 95.5%. So I've just seen this work produce results and change lives. This is changing lives, and that always gives me hope. Changing lives for the better.
Yeah, and I think when we hear specifically from community members who say their lives have changed for the better because of this, and they give their specific testimony, I mean, that, makes you get up and want to sing and dance. And I think more and more people say, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Right.
And so the fact that we have more and more people who are saying that, and unfortunately, we have a lot of really hard, heavy issues that are happening. Teachers burning out, not able to fill classrooms, nurses not able to continue doing their jobs because of their level of burnout, the youth mental health crisis. I mean, we could go on, and all those things. Trauma-informed care, it has to be part of the solution. So unfortunately, those things are happening, but more and more people are willing to consider a different way of doing and thinking about things because of the moment that we're in.
I would agree with all of that, and I think this is one of the most encouraging conversations in the United States at this particular time. I just see so many Americans of goodwill coming together in this space. I think there's a shared commitment to create a society that is more just, that is more healing, that develops more resilience for all people. I think that there's a tremendous there's a tremendous momentum that I think I see. People can, there are real conversations about real policy, about real legislation to move some of this forward. We see states that are making commitments to become trauma-informed states over a period of time. There's so much to celebrate, and I think that what we have to understand is we have to understand the moment that we're in. We mustn't squander the opportunity. I think it must be celebrated. We have to lean into it. And I think now is the time to build our ranks to move this work forward.
Couldn't agree more. And I remember when I was first coming into the movement, I learned about the terms post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic wisdom, where a lot of times when we talk about trauma, we talk about how these experiences can overwhelm us and create so much stress that it tears us down. But with the right supports and relationships and opportunities around us, we can grow through very difficult experiences and be able to emerge in some ways stronger than we were even before. And so while there is a tremendous amount of bad happening right now, to all of your points, I think that as we navigate through this and as we develop meaningful supports and opportunities for individuals, families, and communities to truly thrive, there is an opportunity for our society to grow stronger on the back end of it. And the last thing that I'll say is truly, first of all, thank you, Jennifer, Father Paul, Peter, for the work that you do for this conversation and the community work that you all do, the work that's taking place in all of the communities that you work in. And we know that there are thousands of others around the United States that are involved in this work. That brings me hope every single day. And so appreciate you all sharing a little bit of your time. And again, really hope that we get to do this again.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesse.